Hi, how are you? I'm Mr. Muso. Today we are looking at section C, Zimbabwean history. We are talking about what took place during the colonial administration. Here is our question. Make sure that your pen and also your notebook is close to you. Here is our question for today. To what extent was the second Chimurenga as a result of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act of 1930? That is our question. To what extent was the second Chimurenga as a result of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act of 1930? Let's start by underlining the keywords. Our keywords here are to what extent, second Chimurenga, result, effects, Land Apportionment Act of 1930. So these are our key words. I'll repeat that question once again. To what extent was the second Chimurenga as a result of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act of 1930? So we are going to divide our question into two. We'll talk about the Land Apportionment Act. Then on the other side, we talk about the other factors. Let's start with point number one. We start with the Land Apportionment Act. So we are saying that the second Chimurenga, it took place. Why? It was because of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act. Yes, why do we say so? It is because of segregation. Africans, they were segregated. Africans were removed from their lands. So the segregation of the Africans now, it led Africans to be frustrated. It led the Shona, the Ndebele people to be angered, and that on its own explain why the second Chimurenga War took place. Why? It is because of the segregation in terms of land being removed from their lands. That on its own explains why the second Chimurenga War took place in in the 1950s. Then you move on, you also talk about the issue of destocking of animals. Animals were destocked, that is animals for the Africans. They were not supposed to possess, they were not supposed to have several livestock or several cattle. So by so doing now, it led the Africans to be frustrated. Why? Because they were now left with few livestock, with few cattle, and that on its own, it meant that they were not going to have enough food. They were not also not going to have enough labor to use these animals for different functions, using them for different purposes at their areas, at their homes. So that on its own, it brought anger. So the issue of destocking, decreasing the number of animals that they're supposed to possess at the reserves, at the areas where they were staying now, it brought anger again. And as a result of that, now we can see that the second Chimurenga took place. Why? It was because of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act. The Land Apportionment Act encouraged Africans to destock. They were not supposed to have so many animals at the places where they were staying. So that on its own explains why the second Chimurenga War took place. Then you move on, you also talk about the reserves where these Africans were resettled. They were infertile, the soils were not fertile, the areas were infested with tsetse fly. So because of that, now it was impossible for them to cultivate and have a lot of food on their disposal. Why? It is because of the soils that were at the reserves. So because of that, now we talk about the Africans eventually taking up their arms. They were not pleased about the conditions that they were experiencing at the reserves. So by so doing now, it clearly explains why the second Chimurenga War took place. It was because of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act. Then you move on, you also talk about the underdevelopment. Underdevelopment that was brought in as a result of the Land Apportionment Act. They could not develop. Why the Africans could no longer develop. Why? It is because of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act. They lost their lands, their animals were taken, they were now facing problems of poverty, hunger, and starvation. So because of that now, there is no development. So because of that now, we are saying that to say enough is enough. Then we see them rising on the second Chimurenga, fighting against the wine. So you talk about that. Then you move on, you talk about point number 5. We also talk about the high mortality rate. So many Africans died. So many Africans were affected by serious problems of food, lumo, serious problems of hunger, serious problems of poverty. So many of them died. So because of death now, we see that people were frustrated. Our relatives are dying, our ancestors are dying because they don't have enough lumo. So we see them taking up their lands, taking up their arms, fighting against the whites on the second what Chimurenga. Why are they dying? It is because of the effects of the what of the Land Apportionment Act. Then you also talk about the Land Apportionment Act. It had to reserve areas for the unborn white children. That brought anger. How can you reserve land for the unborn? Unborn white children, already they were having land before they were born. That brought anger. So because of that now we are living in reserves. We are squattered. We are overpopulated at these reserves. And you are already having land prepared for those who are not born. That brought anger. It brought frustrations again. And it explains why the second Chimurenga War took place. Why? It was because of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act. So these are the points that we can talk about on the side of the Land Apportionment Act. I have talked about segregation. I've talked about destocking. I've talked about reserves with infertility soils. I've talked about underdevelopment. I've talked about a high mortality rate, people dying. I've talked about these areas that were reserved for the whites. All these came from the Land Apportionment Act of 1930. But we are seeing that it was not only the Land Apportionment Act of 1930 that led to the second Chimurenga. There were also other factors that led to the second Chimurenga, which are these. Number one, forced labor. Africans were forced to work on mines, forced to work on the lands of the settlers. So that on its own brought anger, again explaining why the second Chimurenga War took place. It was because of forced labor. You talk about the abuse of women. Women were abused by the settlers. So that again brought anger, leading to the second Chimurenga. Then we move on. We also talk about the issue of taxation. The issue of taxation brought anger. Again, Africans, they were taxed. These taxes were high. They were increased time and again. And that on its own, again, it brought anger, leading to the second Chimurenga. Then also the introduction of acts. So many acts were introduced. You talk about the Maize Control Act, the Native Land Husbandry Act. So many acts were introduced by the whites. These acts were meant to suppress the Africans. They were meant to make sure that the Africans remained under their domain. So by so doing now, it brought anger, again leading to the second Chimurenga War. Then droughts that were also occurring. The Africans had to assume that these droughts were occurring because of the presence of the whites. So something was supposed to be done. What was it that they were supposed to do? They were supposed to remove the whites from their areas. So because of these droughts, we see the second Chimurenga War taking place. The ancestral spirits now had to tell the people that these bad omens, they were occurring, they were taking place because of the presence of of the whites. So that on its own again explain why the second Chimurenga War took place. Then you also talk about the unfair system of justice. Africans, the Shona, the Ndebele people, they were not given a fair system of justice. It brought anger. Why? Because they were not tried by a jury. The system of justice, it was meant to benefit the whites at the expense of the Africans. So that on its own again explaining why the second Chimurenga War took place. A poor education. Africans did not receive our quality education. Usually schools were far away from where these Africans were staying. So because of that now, it brought anger, it brought frustrations again. Why? Because Africans were not receiving good education. So the issue of poor education again explains why the second Chimurenga War took place. Also talk about poor health facilities. Africans do not have good health facilities. These health facilities, they were far away from where these Africans were staying. So again, that brought anger again, explaining why the second Chimurenga War took place. Another issue, you talk about freedom of expression, freedom of movement. The Africans could not express, they could not say whatever they wanted to say. If you said anything against the government, you were arrested. You were no longer allowed to move wherever you wanted to move. You're supposed to carry with you a pass. That on its own, it brought anger again, leading to the second Chimurenga. Newspapers, they were censored. They only talked about the goodness of the colonial regime at the expense of what was taking place in the country. So the issue of censoring newspapers, it brought anger, leading to the second Chimurenga. Then you also talk about the arrest of freedom fighters, the arrest of the the nationalists. They were arrested, they were tortured, they were brutalized by these whites, by these settlers. So that again, it brought anger. Explain why the second Chimurenga War took place. Why? It is because the liberation fighters, they were being arrested by the settlers. Then also talk about suppression of political movements, suppression of trade, unionism. These political movements, they were encouraging people to take up their arms and fight now. So because of that now, we see that it led the people to be frustrated, to revolt in the 1950s, they to partake in the second Chimurenga. Why? Because their political parties were being banned, trade unionism was being suppressed. So that on its own again explains why the second Chimurenga War took place. Then you also talk about the poor working conditions that were being experienced by the workers at farms, at mines where they were working. So that again explains why the second Chimurenga War took place. Why? It was because these workers were experiencing so many problems at their workplaces. So we've got so many reasons, several reasons that explains why the second Chimurenga War took place. Although these reasons played an important part now, we see that the Land Apportionment Act, it was also responsible for the second Chimurenga. So that is what we have on this question. To what extent was the second Chimurenga as a result of the effects of the Land Apportionment Act of 1930? Thank you so much. I'm Mr. Muso.